Vaccinations remain a priority in the fight against coronavirus, and the Biden administration has plans to change the way they're distributed. It wants to release every available dose to states instead of holding back half of them to ensure second doses are available. So joining us now is medical editor Dr. Dave Naida. And Dr. Dave, that plan could be risky because it means people may not be able to get their second vaccines in time. So what would happen if someone got their second dose late?
Well, the biggest concern would be incomplete coverage. In other words, incomplete protection, or even perhaps loss of protection. We know right now that after you give the first dose of vaccine, with the Pfizer vaccine, you get about 50% protection. When it comes to the Moderna vaccine, it is approximately 70% protection. And we do know from research that we probably have about 7 days of wiggle room built into that to where we could be a little bit late with that second shot in order to give the booster vaccine would then take the protection level up into the mid 90%, which is very, very good and really what we need. The biggest concern at this time, though, is once again, will we have the dosing available in order to do that? And with the Biden plan, it is in fact the release of 90% of the vaccine, with holding about 10% in reserve for problems. And so it's not 100% release, but close to it. I think the reason why the incoming administration feels that they can do this is that they plan on instituting the Defense Production Act. They plan on getting more money to the states. So there would be some improvement in terms of vaccine production, as well as having materials to administer the vaccines, as well as getting money to the states in order to get workers to help get the vaccines into people's arms. You have to keep in mind that a vaccine that is sitting on a shelf is a worthless vaccine. And at this point in time, with so many cases spreading throughout the country, they feel that at this point in time, the most important thing to do is get vaccines into people's arms and hope that we can, with confidence, produce enough vaccine, but more importantly, distribute it and get it administered. Right now, the states are at a disadvantage because they have not been given enough guidance. There's a patchwork of issues here of how the states are administering the vaccines. It's very confusing. I know that Colorado has attempted to get extra money to assist with administrations of vaccines from the current administration for months and months and months. I know everybody is very frustrated at what's going on in Colorado, but frankly, it's not from a lack of trying. I think that this is a good idea to try to release vaccines and get them administered, along with additional funding to get that administration done.
Interesting. And we know Governor Polis is hopeful that 2 more vaccines could be available soon, one by Astrozeneca, the second Johnson & Johnson. How are these vaccines different than the Pfizer and Moderna ones?
They are substantially different, and I think actually can help quite a bit in terms of just how many people we're going to be able to get vaccinated. Right now, there are 64 vaccines that are in development. There's a lot, but the 2 that are the closest to being ready for administration is AstraZeneca, as well as the Johnson & Johnson vaccination. Now, in terms of the AstraZeneca vaccine, that's already being administered in Europe. It is an effective vaccine, it is a 2-dose vaccine, and it is inexpensive and very easy to produce. And those are very big pros in terms of that vaccine itself. The problem with it, though, is that some of the data in terms of how much dosing to give has been a concern to regulators here in the United States. And so until the U.S. does feel more confident about how much vaccine really does need to be administered during that 2-dose regimen, I think we're going to need to be assured of that before we get an emergency use authorization. Now, in terms of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think this one really could be a game-changing vaccine. And the reason for that is, first off, it is a one-dose vaccine. One, you're done. It has a long shelf life. In other words, it can be administered after it sits in your state at an administration site for up to 3 months. And so it does not require a lot of special handling. So hopefully this is a vaccine that will get an emergency use authorization in early March, and then will wind up being distributed to the states.
Great. And Pfizer says its vaccine is effective against 2 of those new coronavirus strains. One of those strains is already here in Colorado. So, Dr. Dave, these strains are spreading fast. What new information is coming out about these strains?
Well, we do know that there are 2 strains right now with significant mutations, and that is the British strain or UK strain, and then the South African strain. Now, it's not new that it is believed that both of these strains are more contagious than what the so-called original strain was. They do not induce severe illness as we would worry that a mutated strain otherwise might. However, if there are more cases because of the fact that there is a mutated strain out there that is more contagious, obviously people who have high-risk conditions, they are of older age, or have anything else that might predispose them to getting severe COVID, they obviously would get severe COVID and overwhelm our hospital system. So we are concerned about that. We do know that from preliminary testing that the vaccine, at least the Pfizer vaccine, is effective against one of the mutated strains. Most likely the Moderna vaccine is the same situation. One new concern that we do have is testing. We are concerned that the new strains of these mutated viruses may wind up producing a false negative result with certain types of testing. And so we need to be aware of that a false negative does not necessarily mean that you are 100% assured that COVID is not present in a particular situation. And so what we're hoping is that we can increase what we're doing in terms of genetic sequencing. In other words, keeping an eye on how these strains are in fact spreading through Colorado as well as the rest of the country. In the United States, in 1 week, we typically get about 1.4 million positive tests, and yet we're only testing genetically about 3,000 of those. Far too little to have any sort of clue over what these strains are doing and whether or not they would in fact mutate to the point where a vaccine would become ineffective. Colorado has been in the forefront of doing genetic sequencing, and so they are doing a great job. I think this is a situation, once again, where the federal government is going to need to work with the state as well as every other state to provide funding in order to do more genetic sequencing so we know what these strains are doing and whether or not there does need to be a change in vaccine regimen. Final note on vaccine regimens. We think that when it comes to this particular family of coronaviruses, in general, coronaviruses typically take about 3 years to mutate to a point where a vaccine would be ineffective. This is different than an influenza family of viruses. Those mutate within a year. That's why we need an annual flu shot. In this particular situation, there's a possibility that we may need to have a booster vaccine or something different within the next few years, but that's too far ahead to even project as we work on the current situation. I think the news overall is still good with this situation.
Good. That is great to hear. Dr. Dave, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. We'll see you back here next Monday at 11 a.m. as we answer more coronavirus questions. And, of course, to see all of our Q&A with Dr. Dave segments, just visit cbsdenver.com. We'll be right back.